You and I are roughly the same age. I graduated in 2002. It looks like you graduated in
Okay.
2003. So I
Yep.
know
Yep.
exactly what you went through as a kid with the dial-up internet emerging like in high school when you first.
Yep.
Give us an idea. Like, were you always into tech? We looked you up. You majored in comp sci, but I didn't know. Were you always into
Yep.
tech? Like when you were in high school, I remember when the
Oh
internet first
yeah.
came about. I was blown away. But you remember you had to wait like minutes just to see a picture. Like,
Oh, dude, I know. I mean, I guess I probably started with Nintendo way back in the day was the first thing. I started with video games and then eventually got into computers a few years after that. So yeah, like don't remember exactly when, 10, 11, 12, that type of thing. I remember early on, we got a family computer and we got it from this like, random place. But um, I saw them like, actually physically constructing the machines, taking the motherboard and putting the processor on, connecting in the different cards. I was like, that's super cool. So I actually kind of spent a summer like working there, kind of learning the ropes of how these things worked. And of course, back in the day, you had to sell the dip switches and all these things to get everything working. And so that kind of gave me some of the foundations of it. And I remember I started doing some coding, like in BASIC and early C type stuff. And so I was really just into it. I loved the fact that you could create on it. You could make these programs to do things. The early internet, I was on AOL, and then eventually got onto the proper internet. I was on IRC, trading MP3s back in the day, and
oh
like
yeah.
creating bots, IRC bots and stuff. It was fun. Um, but it wasn't until I got to college, and one of the things. So I went to Brown. One of the things I love about their computer science program is just like you're just doing a ton of coding, and you implement
Mm.
all this stuff. And probably the most formative class for me was I took the more advanced operating systems class, where you actually write at least the core part of an operating system kernel. And so there's some things like writing this what's called the switch function. So switch is essentially when you're switching between two different threads or two different processes. And essentially, the whole world, as it exists on a computer, all the state has to be transferred out so that when the new process gets scheduled, it can, have all its memory and registers and all that. And that was just sort of mind blowing implementing that because it gave me such a clear insight into how this thing worked. And it was kind of funny because when you are a normal programmer, you don't think much about how threads or processes are actually implemented. Like these things exist and they're like great concepts to simplify your work as a developer. And so then going in there and actually implementing it and seeing behind the curtain, so to speak, that was absolutely eye-opening for me. And it was one of those things that was just such as I said, a formative moment. And, really set me on this path. My early days at VMware were very focused on these sort of low-level systems implementations and doing that sort of low-level work to create the abstractions that others can take advantage of. And I think that's really been with me. And that's kind of what, if I were to summarize VMware, that's what VMware does, right?
Yeah.
So we solve these really hard low-level problems and create abstractions that users can take advantage of so they're not exposed to all that complexity.
When was the first time you got to build something kind of like bleeding edge, cutting edge? Because you mentioned before you were handling some of like the blocking and tackling fundamentals that they needed abstraction for. When
Mhm.
when did you get your first chance to like really be part of a team that was building something like this? We're going to launch something new, and kid,
Yeah.
you're going to be in charge.
Yeah, so the first time would be when we worked on storage vMotion. And so I took on vMotion and was a tech lead there for a couple of years. And the idea of vMotion is that you can move the virtual machine between two different physical hosts. And it still runs the whole time, by the way. Like
Right.
there's like, even
No
the network
downtime.
continues to operate. No downtime. I mean, there's technically like less than a second of downtime, but because of most applications don't notice, especially if you're using, TCP and so forth, things just work. Now, the problem with vMotion is that the storage is actually locked to a specific device. And so you have some shared storage device that both hosts can see. So the way it works, you basically just close, shut down access on one host and reopen it on the other one. And so that way you're, re-accessing it. But the storage doesn't move. And so previously, before storage vMotion came along, in order to change out the storage, you had to shut down the VM. So unfortunately, a host going down, you can keep the VM running, but storage going down, okay, you got to take the VM down, unfortunately. And this was actually a fairly common thing because people had to do SAN upgrades every 3 or 4 years. Their storage area network would need to be upgraded, so they'd take down all the VMs. It'd be a whole weekend. So what we realized though with vMotion that we actually had the technical underpinnings to make storage work as well, essentially to keep the VM on the same host, but actually switch the storage that the VM was using. And so that was what we did. And, the first version, we kind of It wasn't pretty, I'll be honest, from a technical standpoint, but it was one of those things where we were under a time pressure to get it done, and we knew how we could do it, and it was fairly inefficient. And it like basically made a whole copy of the VM's memory on the same host. So temporarily, it took up twice as much memory as it should have, and it was much slower than it should be. All these other things. So we had all these caveats when the technology was released. But man, the uptake of that was wild. I mean, just absolutely wild. And I remember we have our conference called VMworld. I remember at a VMworld after it was released, I was talking to some guy who was using it, and this guy was raving about it, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm moving, multiple terabytes a day with this thing, blah blah blah," and and I was like sitting there, kind of awestruck, and I was like, as the guy that like built this thing, I would not recommend what you're doing. You're pushing it too hard. And he was like, "No, dude, it works great job," And so I think it was one of those things where it took, and it took me a while to realize why it was so impactful. But looking back, what used to be sort of a multi-month, multi-person, usually multi-million-dollar planning exercise to do a SAN migration, we turned into a drag and drop. And that's the sort of power of those abstractions, getting back to that previous point. And again, it wasn't obvious to me that, I got when we were working on it, because, we had talked to customers beforehand, and they were obviously very excited about the idea of it. But it didn't really hit me as fundamentally about why it was such a good thing. And I think that's one of the surprising things about innovation is that oftentimes the real value of it is not clear until afterwards. Going back to the telco example, when you have a platform and you create something that people can take and leverage, oftentimes you only have a glimpse of what can possibly be done with it. And it really takes the community, the ecosystem coming in to fill that gap, to continue with this sort of innovative thinking. And that was a big lesson that I learned there with storage vMotion.
You create a capability, your customer's going to push it to the limit.
Yes.
Like you said, in terabytes a day was not a limit.
Yeah. I mean, I was scared. I was like, dude, I don't know about that, but okay.
And then eventually and then the other thing is they're going to ask you for more. They'll find the limit, and then they'll say, "Hey, Kit, I need your team to make it bigger, faster, stronger," whatever the case may be. When you think about all these bleeding edge things that you guys are building, what gets you most excited? Is just seeing like what customers are going to build on top of it? Is just the success of your team? What gets you the most fired up?
No, that is, like I'll say with storage vMotion, that was what was so awesome to see, like all the energy that went into it, just from like out in the ecosystem and the customer base. Like people create all sorts of add-ons for it and integrations for it. And it's just so cool to see that sort of creativity coming out. Like people way more thoughtful and creative than me, and kind of demonstrating to me like the lack of really my broader thinking there, right? And so to be challenged like that, and also to be inspired by what they're doing. So that's what really gets me going, because again, it's like in my mind is, this thing's cool, but I don't really get it until I see what other people can do with it.
Hey, thanks for watching. This segment is brought to us by Salesforce Platform. Visit salesforce.com/newsletter to discover timely insights and useful tips tailored to your role. Subscribe to this channel and get more great IT and tech interviews with top industry leaders.